Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Link with Lorraine County page. I am here with Tommy Haney tonight, and Tommy is going to share his experience, strength, and hope with us and his recovery journey. So I hope that you guys will take the time to listen, and I'm sure you will hear something you can take away. So, Tommy, if you want to tell us, start with childhood and tell us what it was like growing up as Tommy Haney.
Hey guys, I'm Tommy Haney. So growing up, I did grow up in an alcoholic home. My mother was an alcoholic and an addict, as well as my father. I grew up in a house. It was me, my sister, my great grandma, and my mother. So growing up, my mom, she would be gone weeks at a time. I always felt that sense of abandonment as a child. My dad, he would come over, every once in a while, and he would only come over to drink and use with my mom. So I really didn't get a chance to get to know him much. He really didn't do much for me in my life, and my grandpa was the one that provided everything that we needed, mostly what we wanted. And so yeah, I felt that loneliness as a child. I really didn't have no one to turn to, because everything on the outside looking in, it looked like things were good, but I was taught to keep everything a secret, so everything was kind of a secret, and I held it all in growing up. And that's what it was like for me.
Thank God for those grandparents, huh?
Most definitely.
So when did you start getting in trouble?
So the trouble started for me. I was involved in sports growing up. So my grandpa got me involved in baseball and bowling. So, when I was out on the baseball field, that was kind of my escape from everything. I quit paying attention to everything going on, and I just enjoyed being out on the field. But one day after a tournament, my buddies were like, hey, if we win, we'll play some beer pong at your house afterwards. So I went and talked to my mom, and she didn't care because she was getting supplied with alcohol. So that was the first time like I experienced, drinking. It was me and my buddies played Four Loco Pong, and I finally got that taste of alcohol and that feeling, and I felt like that was what I was missing my whole life. I finally didn't care what people thought of me. I didn't care what I said, and it helped me escape everything.
And you were how old?
I was 12 at the time.
12 years old. Okay, so teenage years. Tell us when that really started getting more serious trouble and escalating.
So around that time as well, I was hanging out with my sister's boyfriend. I'm sorry. Got that part out right.
Yeah.
All right. So around that time as well, I was hanging out with my sister's boyfriend, and he was a weed smoker. So one day I was sitting there with him and one of my buddies, and they told me to try it, and I tried it for the first time, and I really wasn't a fan. But that second time I tried it, I started smoking weed on top of it. And he shoved a menthol cigarette in my hand. He said, try this, it'll make your head a little more spinny. So I started smoking cigarettes and smoking weed at that time. In between there, I started using pills, experimenting with that. And I love the effect by it. Like I said, drugs and alcohol for me as a teenager, it took away all those feelings of abandonment. I was known as the party guy, so all the parties were at my house because my mom didn't care. So that was my label. Like I finally found, what my title was as a teenager, and that was, the party animal. And, I wore that with pride, even though looking back on it, it wasn't nothing to, feel, any pride about. But I started, taking my grandma's car, around this time, about 15 years old. I give my mom some, alcohol. She'd let me take the car. And, I remember going to, the drug houses to get her what she needed. And that's how I got introduced to all my dealers at the time. And, I got caught driving my grandma's car under the influence 3 times. I got truancy charges in school for not showing up to school. I also got arrested for, bringing liquor and drugs into the school as well. And that's kind of where things started spiraling downwards. And my grandparents were like, can't you see what you're doing to yourself? But I didn't care. At this point, drugs were more important than school. My grades started slipping, and I stopped going to school around this time.
Okay. So all of that trouble brought you to Road to Hope, you said, right?
Yeah, so by the age of 18, that's where like the serious consequences started kicking in. You know, I was arrested 6 times. I caught a whole bunch of charges for, stealing and criminal trespassing, receiving stolen property. The list goes on. My grandpa, he did take me to the psych ward because, he didn't know what else to do with me. He
Mm-hmm.
was like, "You're literally insane for doing this to yourself. You see your parents going down this path, and I
Mm-hmm.
always told myself I'd be nothing like my parents." And I remember my probation officer, it was my last strike. I'm going down the road to prison for a couple years. And she said, "Well, there's this place called Road to Hope in Elyria." And I didn't know what Elyria was. And, I always had an excuse like, I got to get this job, I got to pay these fines. And, a week went by and I ended up overdosing, waiting for a bed. There was a waiting list at Road to Hope. So I ended up overdosing. I went to my probation officer. That was a Friday. I went to her on Monday and I told her what happened. She already knew. The hospital contacted her and she said, "We need to get you up there right now." And, they made a spot for me at Road to Hope. And she dropped me off there on the front step with a garbage bag full of clothes on my back. And she
Here you
said,
are, huh?
"This is your last chance. Figure it out, kid."
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where my recovery journey started.
Okay. So what was that like being dropped off in a place you have never been with people you never met?
So it was definitely a culture shock, but there was a little bit of gratitude because at the end there, towards the end of my use, I'm living in a house with no running water, no washer dryer. I was the guy that had to pick the cleanest, dirtiest clothes out the pile.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, so I had a sense of gratitude to be able to take a warm shower and have a place to lay my head. But I'm 19 years old and I'm around all these older guys and
You know it all, right?
yeah, I know it all and I don't belong here. All these thoughts started going through my head and I tried to seek out the same people that I thought were having my idea of fun, not realizing my idea of fun is what's getting me into trouble in the first place.
Yeah. So when did the switch flip and you decided to get sober?
So, they say like wherever you go, you take you with you. And so my behavior when I got sober, I was a mess. And, I kept getting into trouble at Road to Hope and, I get put on restrictions. And I remember one day, the owner, Jeff, pulled me into the garage, him and a couple guys there. And, they put me on restriction. They said I couldn't go home for the holidays. And I remember that phone call back to my sister and I told her, I wouldn't be coming home for Thanksgiving. I'm in trouble. I got put on restriction.
Mm-hmm.
And at this time, I thought drugs and alcohol were the problem. And, I couldn't blame that anymore. I was sober. I've been sober for a couple months at that time. And, making that phone call and her yelling at me. And, I just broke down in tears. And I just told him, I said, something has to change. And I realized like, just being sober isn't enough. There's things about Tommy that need to change. And I started, taking it serious at that point.
Yeah. So mental emotional health plays a big part in drug use, right?
Absolutely. So I was diagnosed when I was younger. I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and I never treated it. So I feel like, all this time not working on myself and, what I'm feeling inside and
Yeah.
keeping everything a secret, I had all this garbage I walked around with and, drugs and alcohol masked that. So, I was self-medicating for all those years and I didn't even know it.
Mm-hmm. So what do you do today to stay sober?
So today, by the grace of God, I'm 9.5 years sober. My sobriety date's October 22nd, 2015. And, that's the most important date of my life. And, that's when everything changed for me. Today, I got my home group I've been going to for almost 10 years now. I go there every Sunday. I sponsor a few guys. I just make sure I stay involved where it all started. I sponsor a couple guys there at Road to Hope, and anybody who calls me and they need help, I make sure I make myself available like other people did for me, and that's what keeps me going. Helping somebody else, it takes me out of myself, and I stop worrying about my problems and see how I can help them with theirs.
Yeah. Giving back what was given to you, right?
Absolutely. And yeah, life is it's beautiful today. I was able to, buy a house in sobriety. I was blessed with, 2 children in sobriety. Amazing girlfriend. I got a job opportunity I never thought was possible. All these things just from doing the right thing, putting God first, and, sobriety first, a whole life unfolded for me.
So how important is that spiritual aspect, that relationship with God?
Well, spirituality is everything. AA as well, it's a spiritual program. And, without God, there's moments where it's just me and God, like, there's no one else to talk to. And, my prayer life and, being able to pray and meditate and just reflect on things, it gives me that sense of peace, that everything's going to be all right. And I know today that nothing happens in my life by mistake, and it's all part of his plan, and I have a God that loves me.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your story. I know there's a lot of people who are going to relate and going to get a lot of strength from knowing they're not alone out there.
Absolutely.
So if you had words for somebody still struggling, what would you say?
I would say, well, especially like age wise, I know I was 19 when I got sober. I know it's hard being younger, not realizing like, what fun is there in life to have without drugs and alcohol. But I can tell you, I have way much more fun, being sober, and I can actually remember things. And I could just say, give yourself a chance. Who you were isn't who you are. And we all deserve that second chance, in life. And we get the blessing of living 2 lifetimes in one. One of destruction and chaos, and then one of recovery and faith, and it's just peace and happiness, and that's just such a blessing. But yeah, give yourself a shot. Be around people who have your best interests in mind. They say people, places, and things, and that's very important. So just give yourself a shot, listen to other people, let someone else guide you, because nothing in my life is my plan. It's all suggestions from other people.
And it's possible, right?
It is possible. If I can do it, anybody can.
All right. Well, thank you. And I hope you guys will watch this whole thing and send Tommy some encouragement on the post. And we will see you all soon with the next video.